Welcome to the Amateur Hour Sports Podcast, everybody. My name is Jacob Gramenia, and recently I had the privilege to sit down and chat with Mike Commito for about an hour. This episode will be part 1 of 2, and in this episode, Mike talks about his upbringing from university all the way into the hockey media world. And eventually, he gets to how he almost missed out on a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to interview an idol of his, the great one, Wayne Gretzky. Enjoy the episode part 2 where Mike talks about the LA Kings and his opinions on the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Sudbury Wolves. That episode will be out tomorrow, but in the meantime, here is the first episode. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Mike Commito. Mike Commito, he is a team historian for the Sudbury Wolves. He's a writer for the LA Kings and is the author of Hockey 365, Daily Stories from the Ice. Mike, how's it going today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
I really appreciate you taking the time today to answer some questions I have for you. We'll just get right into the questions. So, you've done a ton of writing work with hockey. What got you interested in hockey when you were younger?
Honestly, I just like playing. I was never really any good at it. Played a lot outside, like on backyard rinks in the neighborhood and things like that. Never got into organized hockey though. But I always liked just really nothing quite like playing hockey and being on the ice. And so as I was a kid, it was always kind of something I liked watching, like doing whenever I could. And then as I got older, I went to school to be a historian. So I spent many years in school doing research actually about environmental history. So very much not tied to any of the kind of writing I do now. And then when I was doing my PhD at McMaster, with the playoffs were going on, I was kind of more intrigued about hockey, but more from the professional side of things, and thinking that the writing skills and the researching skills, all those analytical skills I was building as a historian, how could I leverage those into the hockey world? And so I thought more and more that I'm doing all the stuff on the history of black bear hunting and management, for example. I could easily do that on hockey history. And so that's when the kind of, I guess, the light bulb moment happened in university, when I realized that I had a lot of transferable skills that I could write about hockey in addition to what I was doing for my academic studies.
So you were in university, you have a PhD from McMaster, which is in Hamilton. I'm from that area, I know the school very well. So you realized while you're taking this program that you wanted to transfer that knowledge over to the hockey world, and that's where all this writing has come from.
Yeah, like I was at that point, so like this was in, I was in like my just like second or third year at McMaster. And I was increasingly consuming more and more hockey writing. Again, that was right around the time when like analytics started to come to the forefront, and you had more of these blogs that were focusing on, some of the underlying numbers and how can we make sense of that. And so I saw more and more people who were writing about hockey, not as a full-time job, kind of get into it, as bloggers and things like that, and start to carve out spaces for themselves. And a lot of those folks who I started reading back then, now have, prominent jobs writing for outlets now, or they have team jobs. And so it just kind of dawned on me that this is something I always liked watching and playing hockey, and I like to write and I like to do research, and that's kind of when I figured I could put the two of them together. So I just started blogging, made my own website. It was kind of a weird mix of, I was doing NHL previews, but I was kind of sandwiching it between a notable anniversary in Canadian history. So it was this like weird Frankenstein of like, on this day, we signed the Statute of Westminster, and here's all the NHL games tonight that you should watch, and then end it with a Canadian history thing again. And it was like, it was fun for me, but like the readership for that I'm sure wasn't great, because again, you have the hockey folks who probably don't care about the Canadian history, or you have the Canadian history folks that probably don't care that I'm previewing the Jets and Flames game tonight and why that's important. So eventually, as I kind of kept doing that for a little while, I got into writing for a Kings blog as well, the Royal Half. Kind of did it with them with like California history mixing with Pacific Division previews. I eventually just dropped that whole like mashup thing and just realized I should just focus on hockey history, because there's a huge market for it. People like hockey history.
Well, especially in this area.
Yeah, and it's a league that definitely celebrates its past and its heritage. So I just felt like that was probably better for my audience and trying to grow myself as a writer, just to focus on hockey history, and that's what I've been kind of doing ever since.
But for a lot of, I guess, aspiring people want to aspire to be involved in media outlets when they get older, the start is created by yourself. It's very hard to get that entry level experience. So like you were saying how you started your own blog. It's kind of like what I'm doing with this podcast a little bit. Sometimes it's even beneficial just to practice for yourself, and then that way when the opportunity arises to actually get involved in media, you're already prepared and you've already showcased that you can perform in various circumstances. But Once you finished your PhD McMaster, you became a teacher at Laurentian, was it?
Yeah, I was teaching part-time at Laurentian for a little bit.
And was that also, were you doing hockey stuff at the same time as teaching? So you were always doing the hockey work at university.
When I finished McMaster, I got a job as a policy analyst at Northern Policy Institute here in Northern Ontario, but I was working out of the Laurentian offices. And that's when I really started to get more into it. I started writing for Vice Sports, did a couple pieces for Sportsnet that year as well. So that's kind of when it kind of went from, I was writing regularly, but more just from my vantage point, where I started to then at that point with doing stuff for Vice, I was, talking to former players, kind of getting a little bit more serious about it. And then as that kind of progressed and I found more connections and started to build up my portfolio, started to kind of take it a lot more seriously because it was something that I was getting, regular gigs for.
How did you get those first starts? Because like you said, you've done with Sportsnet, you've done with Vice Media, you've done with Sports Illustrated. Mm-hmm. What was the start? What would you say, I guess, is your big break that got you that started that train of events? Yeah,
honestly, it was just a matter of trying to find. Once I figured out who some of the editors were at a lot of these outlets, I just kept peppering them with ideas. Mm-hmm. And some of those ideas maybe were bad. Some of them maybe just weren't the right timing. But I had remembered actually with Chris Tolman at Vice, who I wrote with him pretty regularly for a full NHL season. But before that season, I was sending him ideas every week, if not more regularly than that. And oftentimes he's not a good fit, not a good time. And so I didn't let that deter me. I knew that granted, some of my ideas probably weren't great and he would have said no regardless. But sometimes some of those, you'll get an answer back that's not a positive answer, but it could just be because of the cycle that they're in, or somebody else on their staff has already covered it, or they have another writer doing it. And so I didn't let that deter me. And he kind of told me the same thing, just keep giving me ideas. Eventually we're going to land on something. And then when we finally did land on something, we kind of developed that as kind of an ongoing theme. So when I wrote for Vice that year, it was definitely in the hockey history realm, and we kind of packaged it as, well, we'll do this every week as kind of like a throwback Thursday, right? That's a natural fit for a hockey history story because everyone does TBT anyway.
Yep.
And so that's kind of what broke the door open for me with Vice, is that we, rather than trying to pitch individual things here and there that may have been hockey history related or may have just been something that came into my head, we kind of focused on just kind of making that natural connection with Throwback Thursday and doing it that way. And eventually, as the season got on, and these stories were meant to kind of obviously tie back to Throwback Thursday, but they could stand on their own, and they became just more stories, right? So they didn't necessarily have to come out on Thursday, and they didn't always have that Throwback Thursday line before the title of the article, right? And so once I kind of got in the door with Vice, then then as by doing that, the portfolio ramps up. You're able to kind of show other people, when I'm pitching to Sportsnet, I just wrote this piece for Vice about when the Red Wings played a game in prison, mm-hmm. or something like that. And so you can start to point back to some of your other work, I think, which opens the door and allows people to see your writing skills before they commit to you, right? Again, if you're an unknown author or writer, you're not, it's very difficult for somebody to sometimes take a chance on you. But if you've got something you can kind of point to, they're like, oh yeah, I could read this and I could see a fit.
So you kind of get that jump to Vice, and then it's your first step towards building off of that towards other platforms.
Yeah.
So was the idea for the book that you wrote, Hockey 365, that I alluded to earlier, was that idea presented in those emails that you sent to Vice Media?
No, so the idea for Hockey 365 was actually because I'd written, by that point when I came up with the idea, which would have been in 2017, I believe. Yeah, 2017. And so I'd written for a few years now regularly for Vice and for Sportsnet, and done some other stuff with The Athletic. And I've been operating, my Twitter account for a few years now as well, which specializes in daily hockey history moments. And so I was on vacation in Mexico with my family, and I had the idea. I was reading a book, Val James's autobiography. He was the first African-American NHL player after Willie O'Ree. And so I was just reading that book and thinking, this is the kind of stuff I want to write about. If I want to have my own hockey book. And I thought, well, what could I write about right now? And I thought, well, I had 15 to 20 stories I'd written for Vice. That's obviously not enough to fill a book. But what if I took the idea from hockey Twitter that I was doing on Twitter and did a story for every day of the year? Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of where that idea started to come into focus. Was on that beach, thinking I'm going to go back and start to write a proposal and try to shop this idea around. And really, that's kind of how it all happened, though. But without me writing for Vice and without me writing for Sportsnet and getting that experience, and I think getting some of that validation as well, I don't know if I would have arrived at that idea for the book at the time. I mean, I was under contract to write a book for University of British Columbia Press about my dissertation. It just wasn't something that interested me. I knew that there wasn't likely going to be a job in academia for me, and so for me to spend, untold hours writing a book that I probably wasn't going to get paid for at all, let alone like any, considerable royalty after I sold them, because it would be an academic book. I just kind of cut my losses and decided that that'll never go anywhere. I can always revisit that. But at this point in my life, I wanted to write about hockey. I didn't want to write about black bear hunting anymore. And so that's kind of what happened.
So I find it very interesting that you took your passion and spinned it off into your career path and did it so successfully, because a lot of people like myself who are I'm in a sports administration program, very sports related. It is still very difficult to steer yourself into a media outlet through a sports program, but I find it very interesting that you managed to do so through a program not related to sports, and then took your passion and they combined so well. The biggest thing for me that I have no idea how you do is I follow your Twitter, and every day there's like 5 posts about on this day in hockey, no matter when. How do you keep track of all this information? How did you find out all this information? Can you just go into a bit about that?
So there's a lot of great resources online that do this. I'm certainly not the only one that does like on this day moments in hockey or in sports, and so I've seen it done, and there's a lot of like back end sites that you can get the data from. And actually, the Hockey Hall of Fame used to have this search engine where you could type in the date and it would spit out a bunch of facts. And so one of my colleagues actually shared with me the back end of this site where all of that data is fed into to spit out like a more coherent stat. And so when I started doing this a few years ago, I just kind of combed through this site, and it was just text upon text, right? And you can see the dates were formatted, and it had like a very brief explanation as to what happened that day. And I just started doing that. And then as like my audience started to build up, I started doing it more regularly. So I remember there was a time when, I would do maybe, 4 or 5 a day, and I wouldn't do it on the weekends. And then like the audience started to grow, and I started doing it, 5 or 10 times a day. And then I started doing it on Saturdays, but not on Sundays. And now I do it, there's actually probably like 10 to 12 a day, and it's Monday through Sunday. And so I get my information from a lot of that stuff. And I mean, now that I've been doing it for several years, I have the advantage of being able to go back into my Twitter archive and just find out what did I post last year on this day, pull the information, repost it into my TweetDeck account, so have it all scheduled and laid out. I'll try to change it up from year to year though, so I'm using different graphics or making new GIFs or sharing different videos. And of course, like I do read a lot about hockey history, so I'll pull, when I'm reading a book, like I just read Eddie Olczyk's autobiography recently, so like there's stuff in there that you wouldn't have known about, so you'll pull that and like that'll be a tweet for down the road, and start to just kind of catalog things and kind of build an internal database that I have on my own to populate it.
So if you find out, like say through Eddie Olczyk's autobiography, would you take that fact from a certain day and schedule it in your Twitter in advance for that?
Yeah.
So you'd have tweets scheduled for months in advance, potentially.
Not usually months, just because like it is time consuming. So right now I would say like at the time of you and me talking, like I have 2 weeks worth scheduled, but that's irregular.
Really? Wow.
I just found like a block last weekend where I had time to do it for some reason. And so I got ahead. Usually I'm like a week ahead. So by the time the week ends on Sunday, I'm loading Monday. And the reason why I'm usually having to spend more time is because last year I wasn't tweeting on Sundays. And so this year, because I didn't tweet on Sundays, I have to create new content for Monday, because I'm not be able to go back and go through. Next year will be easier because I've done it every day of the week this year. So I've got like basically all 366 days covered this year because we have the leap year. So
you talk about time, how it's time consuming, but you're also the director of applied research. We are actually at Cambrian College right now where you are in that role. How on earth do you balance the writing, the Twitter, along with your employment?
Yeah, no, a lot of good time management, I would say. Yeah. And I mean, I think I have a very supportive work environment here. They know that I do the hockey writing. I mean, it's pretty unavoidable if you were to look at my LinkedIn or my social media accounts that like clearly I'm writing for these outlets and putting my time into it. So they understand that like you and I can have a conversation about this now, and that's fine. But typically what I do is I do all my work at night. So like I have a very patient wife who allows me to do that. And so I'll just try to know that during the day, if I'm able to schedule an interview with a former player at lunch, then at night I transcribe that interview, write a story, maybe that night or over the course of a couple nights, and just kind of do it that way. And that's always been how I've been organized. I swam varsity at Laurentian for many years, so I think that helps me stay organized because I had to, and I was training like 2 times a day, for 6-7 days a week, and then had to do academics, right? And then as I got into more graduate work, that work ethic kind of stayed with me. And so it allowed me, I think, to get my studies done and then do the stuff that I wanted to do in my spare time. And so that really hasn't changed. It's a little tougher now as you get older and, you get a family and, kids come into the picture and you want to make sure you're spending your time in the right areas. But, 3-year-olds go to bed at 6:30, 7 o'clock. So that still leaves you plenty of time. And so some nights I'm up till 11:30 midnight, but that's just what I have to do, to get that story done. And ultimately that's time well spent in my books.
And if you enjoy it as well, obviously you would be willing to sacrifice extra time. I think it's very beneficial that you live in Sudbury so that you have a lot of hockey fans who are very understanding of the hockey work that you do. And even writing a book is very difficult, time consuming wise. But what were the processes that you took to get a book like this published?
Yeah, so I went through an agent, and so I had to put together a proposal for him, kind of give him a writing sample. He shopped it around. We eventually landed on the publisher, Dunder & Press. And then from that point, went through an agreement with them, signed that agreement. And then I had to so I signed the agreement in August of 2017, had to have the first manuscript submitted by January. So it was actually like a really insane schedule because it was 6 months later, which is not typical, but in this case we wanted to make sure that we had it out for the following hockey season because it was like we wouldn't have had it out obviously for the 2017-18 season, but we knew that if I grinded it out, for that 6 months, we could have it ready for the start of the 2018-19 season. And so I had to make like a really rigorous schedule. I made a little a Gantt chart where I knew I had to write so many stories every day in order to make this happen and get the manuscript done by January 15th. And so I adhered to that schedule. I did have to take some time off work. I remember actually telling my boss I needed to take a week off to do renovations. I didn't want to tell him that at the time it was because it was my book because I thought he might think I had one foot out the door, but I was just really kind of running out of time. And so I remember joking about it afterwards, being like, I hope he never comes over because he's going to see that I haven't done any work in my house. But ultimately, it didn't end up mattering anyway. I kind of told him down the road that that week was so I could finish my book, and he was pretty understanding. But yeah, it was just a matter of very transparent about it with family and friends and my colleagues to say that this is a project that's really important, and so I'm going to take the time to do it. And so sometimes that meant I would go play hockey on Friday nights, and typically we'd go grab a pint or some wings afterwards. And there was many nights where I'm like, I got to go home because I didn't write 3 stories today, and I'll stay up till 1 a.m, get my quota done so I can move on to the next day.
It must have been really reminiscent of your university lifestyle, having to grind through the night. Were there any all-nighters that you had to pull for this book?
No, and that's something I always joke with my wife that I never had to pull an all-nighter in university. I got to 3 a.m. a few times when I was in grad school, but I never got to do the whole all night thing, right?
No sleep. I did it once in my first year. I'm in my 3rd year now, and I haven't done it since because I realized how bad pulling an all nighter is.
Yeah, because then you're wrecked the whole next day, right? Because you got to stay up and then you're crashing.
You're better off with less knowledge and sleep than more knowledge and no sleep, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I was able to manage it pretty well. That a couple late nights here and there, but for the most part, because I think I had mapped out the next 6 months and I knew exactly how much work I had to do on a given day. Some days, if I exceeded it, then I would actually just push it further away, and so. Yeah, it worked out well. I survived and the book came out, so it was all good.
I have the book right here. If you don't know about Hockey 365, I'll link where you can purchase it in the description for the podcast or the video on YouTube. But every single day there's a page story about something that happened on this day in hockey, and basically every morning I'll wake up, probably eat breakfast, and I'll read the one page of the book. So if you look at today, January 22nd, the day that we were filming, it's snowed in. It's about at the Garden State. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, so that was a game between the Devils and the Flames. I think it was 87. And so there was a snowstorm that day in New Jersey, and they didn't cancel the game though. So the whole state was under snow. And it ended up being that only 334 fans made it out to the Meadowlands to watch the game. And they played, so the Flames and the Devils played before 334 fans. Basically.
I think in the article in that book you said it was the least watched game.
Yeah.
Or the least attendance.
Oh yeah, I wasn't able to because when you're looking at the NHL, you got to go back to 1917, so it's hard to get those attendance numbers. But I'm pretty confident that it definitely, at least in the modern era, the least attended game ever, and for obvious reasons, right? And so the Devils ended up beating the Flames that game, and it was kind of cool because given how unusual that game was, the Devils had staff go around and talk to everybody, because you had the ability to do that with 334 people. They got their names, their addresses, and then after the game was over, they sent them all letters saying like, welcome to the 334 club, because you were one of the 334 people that actually were crazy enough to go out in the snowstorm and go watch a hockey game. So they got a letter, this nice little pin from the team that said you're a lifelong member of this club. So one of those cool moments where, again, not important to the game of hockey, like overall, like it's not like a milestone goal, it's not a record, but it's like one of those quirky, cool stories that you wouldn't have known about otherwise, because again, it's just like, but that's hockey history is full of those moments.
I agree. I think with this book, I like how it's not touching on just the basic milestone goals and whatnot. Like my favorite one so far, obviously only 22 days into the year, but honestly, January 1st was my favorite one, the one about Willie O'Ree, the first black player to score in the NHL. I thought that was a very good part of the book, and just learning new things every day that I would have never known without the book. That's what I really like about this.
Thanks. That's what I wanted to get out of it, so that's great to hear.
What went into picking, because you, like you said on your Twitter, you post like 10 to 12 a day. Yeah. How did you fine-tune pick just one a day for this book?
Yeah, so I kind of joke in the introduction of the book that like I had an algorithm that tried to like quantify what was the most meaningful thing that happened that day, but really I just kind of I knew it was significant from my perspective on what happened that day, but I tried to spread it out as best as I could. I mean, there's days when like you could focus on Wayne Gretzky exclusively for like a good chunk of the month, but it's like no one's going to want to necessarily read. Well, actually, people would probably want to read Gretzky 365, but I felt that let's not do that for this book, and so I just tried to mix it up as best as I could. And so there's moments where I don't touch on Wayne Gretzky's one of his point records, because I touch on it in a different story, right? So like, for example, when he scored his 802nd goal to pass Gordie Howe, I didn't talk about that moment. I chose something else, but I mention it later when I talk about Marty McSorley, because McSorley was the one who made the pass to Gretzky on that milestone goal. So for me, it was just kind of important to try to spread it out as much as I could, because again, hockey is a pretty diverse audience, and so you want to appeal to a wide array of folks and fan bases. And so for me, it was just kind of like, if I focus on the team that I follow, the Leafs or the Kings, like that's great for that segment of the audience, but everybody else is why am I going to read this book? I'm a Bruins fan, or I'm a Habs fan. I don't care about that stuff. And so I think that was the kind of thing, was just for me at the end of the day, was like to try to make hockey history fun and accessible, regardless of what happened that day.
And do you have a favorite moment from hockey history?
Yeah, I mean, like for me, like there's all sorts of moments I can remember as a kid, watching the Leafs and Wendell Clark and Gilmore and those guys. But obviously, as a Leafs fan, there hasn't been a lot of like successful moments for me growing up. But the one that kind of stuck out for me in the book was that like when Austin Matthews made his debut on October 12, 2016. My daughter was just a few weeks old, and so we watched the game together. Well, she slept through it, but I watched it. And she had her Maple Leafs pajamas on. My wife was watching the game, and we just, and no one had ever done that before, right? 4 goals in a debut. Incredible. Like that hadn't happened since Joe Malone did it in 1917 in the NHL's first game. And so I remember my wife looking over and being like, "This is crazy. Like, is this normal?" It's like, no, this is not normal.
I remember watching. Like, this is not normal. You're watching something historic.
Yeah, so that was kind of the thing that dawned on me afterwards. Not only like it was important for me because it was the first moment that my daughter and I got to experience hockey together, and so that's something where I'll remember that. So if she does choose to to become a hockey fan or a Leafs fan, then we can kind of look back on that moment as that's the first time you and I would have watched the game together. But I think for a lot of Leafs fans, that game kind of became the where were you when that happened. And I mean, and everyone's always quick to point out, well, the Leafs lost anyway, but it's like, if you're not a Senators fan,
doesn't matter.
I don't care. It's just the 4 goals was electric, right? So that's the one for me that really resonates, because I was able to kind of share my perspective in the book as well.
And I remember your Twitter, in your highlights of the decade, that was your highlight of the decade, that moment. And what was so striking about that performance is that Austin Matthews, up until last week, I think, never got a hat trick in the NHL. As much as he scores goals, he's like the king of the 2-goal game, just like Phil Kessel. Until last week, did not get another hat trick, which is insane to me. But finally,
I had that tweet in drafts for a long time that Matthews finally gets his second hat trick, like
3 years in your draft.
3 years after his debut, right? So,
are there any other books on the way after this one? You were kind of talking about potential.
Yeah, so I'm actually doing a book right now with 2 colleagues and friends, Mark Kuhlberg and Scott Miller. We're doing the history of the Sudbury Wolves in the lead up to for the 50th anniversary in 2022. So that's something we're doing with the local press, Latitude 46. And so that's still a couple years out, but that's the next project I'm on right now. Ideally, I'd like to do another volume of Hockey 365. I think there's definitely a lot of material out there. You could do multiple volumes and kind of mix it up even more than I did the first time around. But it's just kind of a matter of having the stars align for that, and we'll kind of see what happens. Otherwise, I think the next thing for me is, after getting as much mileage as I can out of Hockey 365, is I would still like to write a book on my own that just focuses on one story, right? So it's just a matter of trying to figure out what that would be. I mean, I like doing the Hockey 365, but I also like the idea of being able to kind of do a deep dive on one, particular narrative and kind of really explore that and have that be, my own book.
I'm going to switch over to more of your article writing now instead of your book writing. My favorite article that I've written from you is the Wayne Gretzky article, not the one about his 802nd goal, but the article you did for the Globe and Mail, where you talked about how you almost missed the opportunity.
Yeah.
Can you kind of tell the story about how you got to interview Wayne Gretzky?
Yeah. So that was with the first season I was writing for the Kings, and obviously a lot of the focus that year was on hockey history, and so it was the 25th anniversary of the time that Wayne Gretzky scored his 802nd goal to pass his boyhood idol Gordie Howe for the all-time goals list. And so I said to the Kings that, we should obviously do this story. It's the 25th anniversary, so it's a pretty significant milestone, and we should interview Gretzky. And they're like, he doesn't really do a lot of interviews anymore. Like, don't get your hopes up. And I had tried to reach out to him before through the Oilers PR, and they're like, he's not going to do the interview with you. And so they're like, well, we'll try, but you may have to just write it without his without his quotes. And I'm like, that's fine. So they reached out to the Oilers, and they're like, he'll call Mike tomorrow. And so I was like, okay, I guess clear the decks if he's calling me. And I was trying to find out, do you know when he's calling me? And they're like, they didn't give us a time. And that's the balancing act between work life and the hockey writing stuff. So that morning my daughter was home sick, so I stayed home and no phone call. And then my father-in-law came over to take my daughter for the afternoon. I went out for a work lunch with a new client, and had my phone on as loud as it could possibly be, just waiting for the opportunity. But then as the lunch is winding down, we're still talking about next steps and how we want to develop the partnership. She's looking at me and telling me what she wants to do next and how we're going to continue the dialogue. And my phone rings, and it's Thousand Oaks, California. It doesn't say Wayne Gretzky on my phone because he hasn't called me before, but I know exactly who it is. And in that moment, I have several scenarios going through my mind. It's I can say I have to get this, run to the bathroom in the Apollo, pull out my tape recorder, and do this from a bathroom stall, hoping that nobody comes in and flushes the toilet or all this stuff. And then meanwhile, the clients are back at the table being where did you go for 15 minutes at the end of a lunch? It's going to look bad on me regardless. So, or I could have told her Wayne Gretzky's calling me, I really need to take this. And at that point, I hadn't told them I was a hockey writer on the side, so I'm they're not going to believe this anyway. So I put the phone back in my pocket and finished the meeting. And I've shared her that story I ended up writing for the Globe. And I've seen her many times, and she's like, you looked like you were a mess after that phone call. I'm like, well, now you understand why. I thought I ruined my one chance to talk to Wayne Gretzky, because I called him back after the meeting from my van. He didn't answer, and he ended up calling me later that day. But I remember coming back to work, and everyone's like, why wouldn't you answer the phone? You're an idiot. You write about hockey, and Wayne Gretzky, the greatest player of all time, somebody who I grew up watching, calls you and you didn't answer your phone. And so he did end up calling me. It all worked out. I did the story for the Kings, and I was able to kind of take that behind the scenes story about me just sweating it out in this restaurant, trying to think in my mind, what are you doing? As if you didn't answer that phone call. But that was kind of me trying to do what was right for Cambrian, and ultimately it all worked out for everybody. And now I see her from time to time. And I was at a mining trade show in Timmins in June, and she walked by, and I was on the phone, and she's like, if that's Wayne Gretzky, I want to talk to him. And so I made a deal with her. It's if I ever talk to Wayne Gretzky again and you're around, well, I'll put him on speaker.
So I guess, seeing as you still have a good relationship with the client, I guess that worked out, as well as the interview with Gretzky.
Yeah.
I know in the article you wrote that even though you were a Leafs fan growing up, Gretzky was still, when you were playing on the street.
Yeah.
You were Wayne Gretzky for that period of time when you were playing on the street. So that's the favorite story that I've seen you write. I also really like the one you did when you did an interview with Akil Thomas right before he went off to the World Junior Championship. And if you don't remember, he's the one who scored the winning goal in the final.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that interview for a little bit?
Yeah, so I've been kind of doing a little bit more. I've diversified my writing a little bit with the Kings this year, where I'm still doing a lot of hockey history stuff, but because of the fact that like we're in Sudbury, and it's not as if like I'm in a good vantage point to do a lot of their other kind of writing, or I'm not going to games that often, right? They play Toronto once a year, so but they do have prospects that play in the Ontario Hockey League, right? And so that was one where we kind of circled the calendar to say the Ice Dogs are coming into town, and they were pretty supportive of doing that interview with him because at the time I didn't know about his clothing company Zale, so I wasn't aware that he had this whole side business that he'd started since he was 13 years old. And so they're like, that'd be great to go talk to him. He's got a really cool background story. And so for me, it was cool just because like most of the time I'm doing my interviews over the phone, right? I'm like in my office or I'm in my car, tape recording it, and then I go back and I type it up. But this was one where I got to like meet him in person, talk to him at the Sudbury Arena, and kind of talk to him about what he's doing on the ice, but also how he's developing his business and kind of making a name for himself on and off the ice. And so those are just kind of fun moments for me where I get to kind of step outside and actually feel, not that you don't feel like a hockey writer if you're not interviewing somebody in person, but it's a whole different ballgame, right? It kind of makes you, test your skills a little bit more. It's easier to hide behind a telephone. You don't have to look them in the face and ask them some questions. Or if you fumble on a question, you don't have to look at them and be like, oh, repeat the question or sorry about that. So that type of stuff. So that was cool. And I mean, I got to interview Arthur Calley from the Bulldogs, and that was an interview where I had a game plan prepared of what I was going to ask him, and it didn't go the way that I had thought, but I had been doing all of his account, like tabulating all his goals that year as gifts. So I had this like 30 goal gift thread. And so I kind of realized that the questions I was asking him weren't giving me the answers I was going to need for a story. So I just said, well, let's just go through all these gifts and like, you tell me which ones you liked. And that was kind of the crux, the basis of the story was, watching these goals with Kaliev and having him tell me which ones were important and which ones were memorable for him.
I'm just thinking again about the Wayne Gretzky part. I'm just thinking of what I would do in this situation, because your phone rings for 30 seconds, so you have to process every scenario within this 30 seconds. And I guess in hindsight, you can maybe think, okay, I could have just picked up and said, can I call you back in 10 minutes or whatever. But in the moment, I can't even go about my feelings if I felt like I missed a phone call with Wayne Gretzky. I can't even imagine what you were going through.
Well, that was my thing. It's like I can't possibly pick up and tell him I'll call you back. It's like you called me and you don't normally do interviews at all.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like I felt it was probably, if I was going to do anything other than take the call in the bathroom, which was still not a good idea.
You can't do that.
Best just to not even pick up at all and then try to explain later that sorry, and I mean, and that's kind of what I thought about too, is that at the end of the day, he is obviously Wayne Gretzky, but he's also just a human being. So he's got to understand that I'm not just glued to my phone all day waiting for him to call me. And that's kind of the other thing, is that he was pretty gracious about it. When he called me back, I apologized for not answering earlier. And he obviously it was no big deal to him. But it meant a lot that he obviously still took the time to call me back, because I thought for sure that one time only, and then how am I going to explain this to the Kings? They don't get interviews with him that often either, so this was kind of a big deal for the club as well. But like you said, it all worked out for everybody, and so no harm, no foul.
So that was episode 1. Tomorrow's episode, like I said, Mike will give his opinions on the LA Kings, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and the Sudbury Wolves. If you want to check out that episode, you'll be open tomorrow on Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube. All the links for those programs are in the description. If you want to stay updated for that episode or any future episodes for the Amateur Hour Sports Podcast, be sure to follow us on Twitter or Instagram at Amateur Hour PDC. You can subscribe on YouTube at Amateur Hour Sports. You can follow on Spotify. Like I said, all of the links will be in the description. I have also put all of Mike's links. Go check out his book. I've linked the Amazon. That's where I purchased the book. I love the book. I will link his Twitter. You should follow him there. But as usual, we post every single day on the Amateur Hour Sports Podcast, so keep coming back for that daily content. We will see you tomorrow.